This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is entitled Related Services in a Virtual World, Teleservice Moving Forward. Our presenter today is Carlin Higbee. Carlin is an education consultant as part of the special education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, as well as an occupational therapist who has practiced for nearly 40 years in both school-based and or outpatient pediatric settings. She has supported students with educational disabilities both as a practitioner and as a trainer, coach, and educator for other educators. Carlin's experience is conducting trainings and consulting with school districts, and it's helped many school-based therapists and educators improve evidence-based practices such as service provision in the least restrictive environment and through the use of collaborative goal writing strategies within the IEP. It is my pleasure today to introduce to you Carlin Higbee. Carlin?
Thanks so much, Bonnie. It's really good to be here. Yeah, I think that covered who I am. Just so you know, another hat that I wear right now is that CISA 1 and the Department of Public Instruction have a grant opportunity that they're working on together, and that is through the CARES Act. It's an ESSER grant, and part of what my role is in the context of that grant is we are looking for ways to support families and therapists as we learn how to use teleservice moving forward. That's partly why I selected the title for today's presentation. We're going to have a series of short videos that are going to be a part of this teleservice fast forward project. And so it is with that hat on as well that I bring to you this information, and I'm looking forward to questions and conversation. And so I think if that's okay, Bonnie, we'll just get started. And I'm going to clear my throat here real quick. I apologize to everyone. I've got my glass of water here, so we're ready to go. So today, our learning outcomes, I hope, will be that you will gain some understanding about the benefits of virtual services, that you will learn about some of the best practices that we have seen emerging as we've looked at teleservice for school children. And we're also going to talk about state and national resources that are available to support virtual services. The first thing that I want to take a minute to mention is that we do have a couple of definitions here that we're going to think about, and get myself onto the right page here. Pardon me. But we chose the word teleservice last year as we were considering some guidance around this, because I know you probably are very familiar with the terms telehealth and telemedicine. But one of the things that we noticed in the midst of COVID last year was, as people were kind of rushing to figure out how to best provide services to students, was that we saw some providers understandably falling back into what I would say is a much more siloed, kind of medically based versus educationally based method of service delivery, where it was out of context with what the students' needs were, maybe in the classroom, maybe not even completely in alignment with the goals in the IEP. And part of that was because our learning curve was so steep as we moved into this area. So part of our rationale as we, pardon me again, I'm going to mute my mic for a second. Thank you. As we moved into this, is we wanted to emphasize that when we're talking about school-based services, we're really talking about teleservice. And hopefully that word will help people remember that OT, PT, speech, and any other services, social work, counseling, are related services that are still intended, even in a virtual model, to support the child in their educational program. And we're going to talk today about the wide variety of ways that we can do that and think about it. So with that in mind, there are just a couple definitions that I just would like to clarify before we go on. We're talking about just virtual learning, and there were some administrative rule changes that were made to recognize the new and emerging method of service delivery and instructional programming. So we've got that online learning, which is instruction that takes place over the internet. I'm sure you may have heard terms like synchronous and asynchronous. So both are perfectly reasonable methods for service delivery. The synchronous would be live, interacting, kind of like we're doing right now. Asynchronous would be when parents or children avail themselves of recordings provided by their related service provider or their teacher, completing independent work like a home program. All of those kinds of things would all fall under that heading of online learning. And then there's digital learning in general that can just take place during online or in-person learning. So let's go to the next slide here. Bear with me, I'm managing both my speaker notes and my presentation here, so I'm not a really good ambidextrous person, so bear with me. So we do know, believe it or not, that there really are some benefits of virtual services, and there's some interesting research that's already emerging around OT and PT and speech and language support that was provided last year, giving us information that helps us know what worked, what didn't, what made something effective, what are the components of it. I was in a national webinar just a few nights ago, and they were presenting some of this preliminary research, and it was very interesting. This research is showing that it is both feasible and effective. It is equally as feasible and effective as in-person intervention when we take a few things into consideration. And this body of literature really is holding out some very positive outcomes for teleservice. So I hope you'll share with me as we go on, both your positive and maybe not so positive. I know those stories are out there as well. One of the things that I have found really interesting as I've been doing this work, both for the Teleservice Grant Project and just in my own work, I am still part-time in a school district, is that many of these strategies we're going to talk about this morning apply to best practices for method of service delivery, whether it's in a virtual learning mode or whether it's in face-to-face learning within the school building. So that's been interesting, and to think about with other people, both locally and nationally, how do we help support parents and therapists as we move forward with this? One of the things that we found is when a person is involved in the home, either a parent or making sure that we set up an additional connection with perhaps a paraprofessional from the school, either joining the student online or perhaps finding time for that person to come into the home for brief periods of time, that actually helps to support the teleservice or virtual learning for service delivery. And as you know, when I'm sure all of you are coming from various places throughout the states, where we have a wide variety of things. For example, in my school district, we are live, but we have some children whose parents have selected to not be in school right now, so we're providing services for them in a wide variety of ways as well. Whoops, I'm not sure what's happening here. I don't want you to see that. There we go. So just a quick review here for us. I want to just make sure we're all kind of on the same page with a review of what the intention of related service providers is through IDEA, sorry. The primary thing that I want, the takeaway from this slide is that OT, PT, and speech is a little different because it can be both a standalone program where there's specific special education criteria for that, and it can also be a related service. So when we're talking about related services, OT, PT, and speech as a related service, there's no criteria for that. The IDA is very clear that the decision about whether or not a child needs a related service to benefit from their educational program is the decision of the team based on what the student's needs are, and then based on what the student's goals are, and then the team has a conversation about how to best support those goals. And sometimes that might involve related services. I think also we should have just a really quick conversation about setting matters. So again, this kind of refers us back to that earlier thing that I mentioned about that distinction between medically based services versus educationally based services. And IDEA is very clear that the decisions for whether or not a child receives related services, whether it's teleservice or in-person learning, should be driven by their educational need. So we see that here. Context is critical. The student's individual circumstances should inform our focus and our interventions. So we want to think about how do we provide our services, again, whether in person or virtually, that are consistent with that concept of least restrictive environment. Our ultimate goal is to enable the child to be involved in their educational program and to progress in their with their same age peers to the greatest extent possible. So the reminder that school-based services are not intended to address medical conditions and impairments, and we want to really focus on the full potential of independence and participation through modifications, accommodations, and then actual skill development as needed for the student. And sometimes that just takes on a very different look when we consider virtual services. All right, go to the next slide for my speaker notes here. Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, I think this is kind of a summary of what we've been talking about, whether it's virtual learning or face-to-face learning, the considerations for how we select the best practice strategies applies across all learning settings. What we find, however, is that when we suddenly went to virtual learning last year during the the closure of everything in the world practically, we were encouraging, DPI was encouraging districts to look carefully at the IEP. And in some cases, some IEP revision was necessary. For example, we wanted to make sure that every student could actually work on a goal that was meaningful to them. So this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think it illustrates a point. If the student's goal was to be able to walk to and then operate an elevator in the building, we're not going to have an elevator in the home. And so that would have required a change in the IEP goal because we couldn't work on skills related to that goal in the home environment. So what we were encouraging people to do were to kind of reassess through interview with the parents, looking at, let's say, for example, the disability-related need that led to that goal was the child needed to increase some stamina for getting to the elevator. They may be able to, they may have had a need related to their ability to problem solve. And so maybe addressing those two needs and building their endurance and problem solving could still be addressed, but the goal itself might need to be rewritten so that they could work on that skill in the home that would then generalize into the school setting. So I'm just going to wait here and see if there are any questions about that. But when we look at service delivery models, I'm just going to redirect your attention to this second part of the slide. We have a wide variety of models that are still applicable in teleservice as well. We can do direct or indirect services. So indirect might mean providing exercise or activity programs that are implemented in the home when the child's not directly involved in an online exchange. The interventions could be created that would be provided during whole class time. I know of one district where the therapist, continuing now to do online instruction because of the COVID situation in their district, has a paraprofessional assigned to her more or less, and that paraprofessional is working with the therapist and then implementing those strategies as the therapist and the teacher and the para are talking about what are the strategies that should be integrated into the child's activities. And again, bear in mind that each of these service delivery models will vary depending on the student's needs. Again, so they could be small group instruction, a coaching model, which is getting a tremendous amount of support in the literature as being highly effective, consultations, as well as then considering whether or not the services would be provided through a synchronous or an asynchronous platform.
So Carlin, we have one question, if you don't mind, very quickly.
Sure.
And that question is about the medical model versus the educational model. And if a family has chosen to receive like occupational therapy services through a hospital-based therapy, but that there's a need for like consultation at the school level or whatever, how effective is it to make sure that those consultation services are written in the IEP?
Well, again, each circumstance is different, but I will try and answer. And please, whoever that is asking it, feel free to let me know if I've kind of hit the target or not. Maybe just do it this way. Could the person say whether or not the child currently has an IEP?
I believe so.
Okay, but is OT a part of that IEP or not?
I think they're at the point of wanting to get it to be included.
Well, if there is no OT in the IEP at this point, but there are accommodations for the student that need to be made, that would be addressed through their special ed teacher. Number one, it would be, I call this a multi-layered and complex question. So that's one way to do it. The OT cannot be involved in communication about that student unless the student is on the OT's caseload currently. So that would be number one. If there are concerns in the educational setting about how the student is able to access and engage in their educational program in areas that might be related to OT support, then by all means, an OT evaluation should be initiated, and that would have to be done in the context of an overall IEP re-evaluation. So if a child is already receiving special ed, but OT is not a part of it, and there is concern that maybe OT needs to be a part of the IEP team, then an evaluation would need to be started, and the OT would then conduct an evaluation. As a part of that evaluation, it would be appropriate for the OT to have access to the medical records, which the parent would have to sign off and make sure that happens, to sign all the appropriate releases. And the OT would then include that information in their report. What's important to remember in this scenario is that the child may have needs that are more appropriately addressed in the medical setting, because in the schools, we're not as concerned about what their specific strength level is or their range of motion is. Our concern is, can the environment be adapted and modified to meet their needs? Are there strategies that need to be integrated into the classroom, and we certainly provide support for that. I'm not implying, so please don't misunderstand, there are times that it is still appropriate to pull a student out of class, but when you read IDEA and the intention of trying to provide least restrictive environment for all of our students, there's some really interesting studies out that really should give us all pause for that old traditional model of pulling students out of the classroom for therapy, because we find that they miss out on so much socialization. They miss out on so many contextual things that they otherwise would be getting in the classroom. So part of that OT's job, if that parent were to request a school-based OT assessment, would be to combine that information from the medical provider and look at the child's performance in the school setting, what goal areas or needs areas in the IEP are not currently being addressed, and then the team that would include the parents would make a decision about whether school-based therapy is appropriate. So if that's an answer, we'll go on. If they need more information, I'm willing to keep working at it.
No, that's fine. Thank you so very much.
Okay, good. So again, this kind of just says exactly kind of what we said. So perfect timing on that question. Students' needs also are going to be different for different modes of instruction. So um, they may have a need for OT services in a different way. There were a lot of services, there were a lot of students that when this happened last year, there were a number of students that I was providing services for in the classroom in terms of program modifications and supports and strategies that I was coaching staff so that they were consistently utilized for the student. Um, there's some also really interesting research out there. Some of it comes from therapy literature when we talk about how the brain learns. And if you think about how an infant, there's a really good example that someone I know uses in his presentations nationally, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but when a baby is learning to walk, that child spends just an incredible amount of hours practicing, and that somebody actually calculated once, it's like 100 and I don't know, 600,000 times up and down a football field. And so you think about what the brain needs for our students is far more than just being pulled out to therapy for 20 minutes. I mean, sometimes that can be very helpful, but also they need those strategies so they can have the repetition for the brain to make the adjustment. So some of the kids that I was seeing in the classroom, because those needs and the goals in the IEP might have changed and the needs in the home setting are very different, I shifted to a different service delivery method. So all of that can change, just like that changes sometimes when children make a transition. Even in brick and mortar schools, they make that transition from K4 to K5 or from into middle school or high school. So we want to remember that those services should be very flexible as based on the student's needs. All righty. So this is just kind of a list. Again, we've covered this in many ways. What a therapist should be looking at is, how is a student able to live into their role as a student? What are their interaction skills like with the teacher, with their peers? What's their learning process like? What are the areas that OT, PT, or speech might address? I think of learning process with how does the child scan visually or make those visual gaze shifts from up to the chalkboard or back to their desk? Speech might be involved as far as their learning and language processing skills. A common area that we know OT looks at is that personal care area, what modifications and adaptations might need to be in place. Play and recreation, we want to look at written communication in the context of, does the child have the motor components for that? And assistive technology. And again, does a child have the motor components and the processing skills available to be able to do that? And I want to make a little plug for my fellow OTs out there. Our job is not to teach handwriting. Our job is to make sure that the children have the motor components or the modifications for writing that they need, and then to find ways to make sure those supports are available to them every time they're doing a writing assignment in class. We also work on community participation. I'm involved oftentimes at the high school on that transition stage for students at that level. And of course, again, positioning and making sure that that's appropriate for the child. And the ways that all of those things might still be addressed through teleservice might be a little different, but they're all equally as important. And we're going to talk a little bit on another slide, I think, about how parents felt positively about seeing some of their child's needs in a different way when they had the opportunity to have a relationship with a therapist. So I'm going to wait a minute, see if you have questions, and I'm going to clear my throat again. I don't know why this morning is so bad.
We don't have any questions at this time.
Okay, well, I had my drink of water and I'm back, so thank you. Okay, this is a really helpful drawing, and maybe some of you are familiar with this. This is called the International Classification of Functioning, Health and Disability. It's ICF, was developed in 2001 by the World Health Organization. And there's this whole movement in the disability world, and so some of you parents may be very familiar with this, but it's that reminder to all of us that disability is not an all or nothing proposition, that a person's disability changes in relationship to the barriers that they encounter in their environment. So throughout the therapy world, and I know this is also a topic written about quite a bit in disability literature, but the idea that we're focusing on this activity first, and then taking into consideration all of these other factors that may impact the child's ability to function. So that's why in teleservice, we're really looking at, okay, so now what are the new activities this child might need to draw on, or the new skills they might need to draw on in order to access their education now that it's gone to a virtual platform. So, so this is a really nice frame of reference that is very helpful. We're really shifting culturally as a society to this kind of social model of disability rather than a medical model, even in the medical community and in the rehab community, where we think about those social constructs of disability. Again, what are the barriers in their environment, or what are the ways that the activity is constructed that is what's increasing the person's disability instead of enabling ability. So I always say to people when we think about this to kind of shift that whole model on its side and start first to think about, especially in school-based practice, where do we want that participation level to be? What's our expectation of that child in terms of participation? So when we look at teleservice, there are a whole lot of things that we're going to be talking about, what we think about in terms of helping them participate in their virtual learning or in their teleservice interaction with their related service provider. And this, again, is another that's kind of that rose is a rose is a rose. All of these considerations I'm going to be talking about apply in teleservice as well as in face-to-face learning. Oh, that's just a kind of a fun thing I added, but the timing of it is never right. So the next slide, there's a website, and I put the link here, and I think, Bonnie, didn't we give them a handout? So it should be a live link, but for educators and for parents that are here today, this is just a wonderful website, and they really focus again on this empowerment for parents and families. I also think one of the words I really love to use is they focus on building capacity in our learners, our little learners, and our big learners who are our colleagues and our parents and ourselves just as much. But this is taking that same model of the International Classification of Function, and they call this the F words in childhood disability. There is, and Bonnie had asked me about whether or not I had a video in here. They have a great video at this website about the F words in childhood disability, and I encourage you to go look at it. And it's another way that as we talk about the coaching model of intervention, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more just in a few minutes, but this is a nice way to remind us we might want to talk about, okay, how is the child doing with friendships? what are the physical factors? So I kind of changed that to, instead of the PH, to the F, so it fit with the F word. But then to think about what are the fitness needs, that endurance, what are the family factors, the internal resources, what are the strengths that the family has in terms of supporting the child, what are some of their barriers, are both parents working, all of those kinds of things. And then how does the child have fun, not only with their family, but on their own? And so these are things that we can focus on as well as we look at an IEP that might better address when the learning environment is virtual and in the home. So I want to say a little bit now about how we conduct assessments virtually. So this would count for evaluation, which is special ed evaluation, and the ongoing assessments that we do for progress monitoring and making decisions about changes that might be needed in an annual IEP. But we want to think about assessment and intervention in the natural environment. So again, when it's virtual, we want to think about that environment as the home or the virtual classroom if the child has the skills and is able to participate when the class is gathering virtually for a portion, or all of the day. We want to increase the effectiveness of the interventions we're doing. So we want to think about that as we're doing an assessment. We want to increase the achievement towards the IEP goals. And I think most importantly, we want to think about how do we address motivation and engagement on the part of the student and sometimes the parent. There are a lot of times that parents don't really even know quite how to be engaged in that process. So I think it's incumbent on the therapist and the providers to be thinking about that as well. So this is another piece that is, I know DPI right now is doing a series of continuing ed live trainings, and we'll be doing some recorded on-demand trainings. We're looking at how do we best conduct assessments that really capture what the student is capable of doing. So static measures, such as some standardized and formalized tests, don't really capture. They capture a moment in time, but they don't capture things like if I provide a moment of training as I'm looking at a child's skill, and that child is able to process that information and then accommodate it and make a change, that tells me a lot. But if I am only using a standardized test that says I have to present it in this specific way, the child has to have this specific response within this specific amount of time, that doesn't really take into consideration the child's overall capacity for taking in information and maybe making a change. And that's important for me as a therapist to know, because that's going to affect the recommendations I make to the team, to the family, and how I approach the students. So we're really stressing the importance of what some of the terms that you might hear about this as routines-based assessment, dynamic assessments, and authentic assessment. All of those assessments are actually based in student performance and student routines, and they better address that kind of discrepancy between test performance and real life performance. So this is the same in teleservice as well as face-to-face learning, and there are a variety of assessments out there that can help support a therapist or a provider in doing that. One of the things that I talked about was the routines-based assessment, and this model is a wide variety of practices together. So it's not only routines-based assessment, but it's a whole intervention model that I have been very excited about in my own practice. I've been following this model for, I don't know, maybe close to 10 years now, and it's really wonderful. So if you ever look up anything about McWilliams, his name is, and it's actually an S on there, that was a typo on my part, but it's Robin McWilliams. But again, it focuses on everyday routines. So again, not only in the home, but in the school setting. And how do we, again, look at, as providers in the school, educators, how do we make sure that we are looking at every routine throughout their school day and maximizing their engagement and participation with their peers? So the other term that I think I had on that slide was both dynamic and authentic assessments. Again, these are very specific approaches. Dynamic assessment is written about in the speech therapy literature, but it is parallels models that are also addressed in OT and PT literature. Um, this assessment model is an approach that assesses how a child makes those cognitive changes in learning, like the example I gave you, that if I am in the midst of my assessment process and I make a suggestion or I model something different and the child is able to make that accommodation, that is a very pivotal part of a dynamic assessment. It takes into consideration the child's problem-solving skills and in the context of real activities that they might need to do. It also gives us information about how the student reacts to instruction and how they react to that interactive process. So authentic assessment is also a very similar term that you'll find in the literature. This you'll find mostly in the OT and PT literature, but it parallels, one of the things I think is so interesting as a therapist, I have always been kind of a literature nerd and have always been one to read. As a matter of fact, I'm getting ready to make that major downsize move in this particular stage of my life. And I found articles I've been saving since the 80s, and many of them were beginning to address this kind of model even then. So that's how long it takes for that to kind of trickle down. But in this authentic assessment model, again, we're capturing real life behavior in everyday settings. So you can see how in a virtual learning situation, using this lens to have a conversation with the parents, have a conversation with the child, depending on their age and their skill level, um, really provides this whole uh, broader arena from which we can begin to look at ways to support the child's progress. It's a very collaborative process, looking primarily at the child's strengths and challenges as they engage in everyday activities, but provides a way to kind of scaffold onto the strengths that they already have and really holds those up. And again, this model is a great way to do progress monitoring, because if you've done your assessment in the context of actual functional routines, then your progress monitoring is going back and capturing that same routine and looking at how have they actually progressed in their performance of that skill. So now I'm just going to shift a little bit to some of the things that this comes from OSEP. This is a great website too that has tons of information and resources. But these were some of the things that they talked about in this article that came out after the teleservice thing, is to think about access issues. So this is another aspect of that best practices. We want to make sure that we're looking at what kind of hardware, computer, laptop, et cetera, is available to the child in their home, software, high-speed internet. I'm sure all of us are familiar either through the news or personal experience that is not consistent across the board for many of our students, and different districts handled that differently. Some of them were able to provide computers for students. My 4-year-old grandchild is an MPS, and his preschool program provided every student with a laptop computer last year so that they could log in and be a part of their little preschool program, and it worked really well. But for some districts, that is not necessarily an option because of financial concerns. There's also that individual level of access, the child's cognitive ability, their executive functioning, their physical and sensory concerns can often be an issue, their communication needs, their reading ability, and their ability to use technology. And one of the things that OSIP didn't add into here, but I think also that um, the family resources, having someone in the homes. We had children who were simply cared for by an older sibling because both parents had to work and the children couldn't be at school. So this is just that to kind of get us thinking about there are kind of those foundational issues that we have to think about in addition to all of those other theoretical approaches for providing services. So some of the other considerations that we wanted to be sure we're thinking about are, the needs of the student. And this was when I referenced this a little bit earlier, as we look at that IEP, we meaning DPI, encouraged IEP teams to re-look at those IEPs and those goals. There was some grace period allowed from DPI because there were a number of districts that just simply couldn't find the time to go in and redo the IEP. So as a result, there may have been very limited progress in the specific goals that were addressed in the IEP. That doesn't mean that there wasn't progress made for the student, but from a kind of legalistic standpoint, perhaps the progress on the specific IEP goals wasn't met. Where districts were able to follow the recommendation and reconvene the IEP to redo the IEP goals, they were done in relationship to newly identified disability-related needs while the student's in the home setting and in the context of virtual learning. So that's one thing we wanted to be able to be sure we encourage districts to do, and to be mindful of the fact that meaningful goals needed to be created for this new learning environment. It's also important that there's a clear understanding on everybody's part of how services are going to be provided and how progress is going to be monitored. So again, there were students that I saw more directly in their classroom, working closely with their teachers, where the model might change and I would provide check-ins with the parents based on their preferences and the child's needs, sometimes weekly, sometimes twice a month, with the asynchronous types of programs then available to them, and my providing coaching to the parents, and maybe not as much direct services to the student based on the student's needs, like we saw on the slide prior to this. So there's just a wide variety of approaches that we can use with this model. I just thought it would be important because I know every district is a little different in how they think about these disability-related needs. And for those of you who are with us today who are teachers, I would say to really think about how you use that section in the IEP. I know districts I've worked with often just kind of brush over that and don't give that much thought. I consider it one of the most pivotal portions of the IEP, where a deep, meaningful conversation with the whole team about what are the barriers that are preventing this child's ability to achieve whatever the activity is. So, and for those of you that are parents, I would encourage you to encourage your teams to spend some time on that portion of the IEP. An example that I sometimes use for this is, let's say that we've noticed our little K5-year-old is not able to get out of the building in time at the end of the day. They're having trouble with that entire dismissal routine. And by that, I would say, I mean, putting their folders back in their backpack, getting their materials, putting on their outerwear, putting their materials into their backpack, and then being ready to line up with their peers. So it's really important if that is the identified behavior. So think back to that international classification of function. That's the behavior that the team has decided he needs to be able to do this. When you have a good conversation about the disability related needs, you might find out that it's really not motor skills, it's really not balance and coordination that's affecting that. It's distractibility and more of that executive functioning processing problem. So again, that's why having that conversation and really looking at what are the barriers or the disability related needs help to determine that goal is going to stay the same. The goal is going to be, we want Johnny to be able to get out of the building and get his outerwear on and do all those things independently, but it might affect how we determine what services he needs to support that behavior. And the same is true in the virtual setting. We want to have that really good conversation about what are the barriers. Is it technology? Is it support in the home? Is it the demands are just too high for him in this setting and we need to rethink the whole way we're delivering services in this new environment of the virtual learning? The other thing I always like to be sure is we think about that supplementary aids and services and make sure that we're utilizing that well. Um, for students in virtual learning and in face-to-face learning. So when we think about this, I'm looking to see here what I wrote on my thing and why I put this slide in here. I think the point is to just think about if the child's disability is he has difficulty using both hands to complete functional tasks. This is that part that I was saying, depending on what the goal is for face-to-face learning, the student may not be able to achieve that specific goal in virtual learning, but if the disability effect is still there and the need to improve his application of motor skills for the completion of a task, we need to figure out how to best provide services and develop a goal for virtual learning that would still help him progress based on the effects of his disability and his disability-related needs. And strategies for that also can be provided through supplementary aids and services and not necessarily through direct therapy intervention. I think this issue about engagement is another area that we want to really think about. It has a variety of meanings in different contexts, and today I just want to discuss a few things about overall parent engagement and child engagement. So there is again this great measure on the Can Child website, and particularly for younger children and children that are perhaps more significantly involved in relationship to their disability, this is a wonderful tool, and I would recommend it for both face-to-face learning and for virtual learning. And again, if you think back to the slides we had earlier about, DPI is really encouraging us to think of other ways to measure a child's performance other than those standardized tests. And this becomes another way to get good descriptive language to really identify where the child might have needs and to then use that not only for information that's helpful in an assessment, an initial eval or an ongoing assessment, but also a really good tool for helping a team do progress monitoring. So I recommend that you take a look at that tool. It also, we want to think about those higher levels of self-determination that are correlated with positive school performance, outcomes, and independent living. So these are all things to think about. I think I probably mentioned this a little bit before about, I may have gone one slide too far. Again, yeah, this is another thing about, there's a really great article, I reference it here, but if we think about engagement, especially as we think about student engagement, we see when a child is really engaged, we see better understanding, they have better academic performance, they have that feeling of efficacy. There's a huge amount written in the disability literature about that empowerment, enablement, self-determination aspect of needing that we know we need to pay better attention to this because that can become a huge barrier to their ability to go beyond school, go into independent living or some kind of supported living situation, transition services into jobs, etc. So when we think about supporting engagement, one of the most important things that we need to think about are finding those opportunities for engagement, which again brings us back to that whole routines-based thing. When we integrate our therapy strategies into some of the normal routines, not only are we working on skill building and capacity building, but we're also building on that sense of accomplishment for the child. And that is one of the reasons I think that this whole model is getting such support. And also, when we look at that engagement piece and looking at ways to support their engagement, it opens up a wide variety of other areas where the student may have needs and where our services can be of value. So now I want to talk if there's any questions. This is a good time if there are any. Otherwise, I'm going to go into kind of some of those things I've been talking about in terms of those service delivery models, that coaching, goal-directed training, and then also that student, family, and engagement piece. Are there any questions, Bonnie?
Just a quick question, and I believe this is from a parent that says, um, with this new teleservice delivery, et cetera, not only are we parents, but we also are workers, and now we have to be not only a teacher, but a therapist as well. I don't know if I can wear that many hats.
And I would say I hear you. Totally, I hear you. And I just have to say, I totally agree. And I think that for some families, this is just a huge shift. And as providers, we need to think about that. So, in this particular instance, I would encourage a conversation with a therapist. So many of the parents that I know, I'm going to give you an example. I have a little guy that I'm working with now, and if I tell you his diagnosis, it's so rare, some of you might know. So I don't want to do that, but leave it to say that he has significant involvement in his visual system, hearing system, motor planning, everything. And it's very difficult for him to get engaged in any activity. And yet, he's very aware of what people are doing around the home, and he is mobile. So the mom has been really thrilled. She was very overwhelmed for that exact same reason. She had to work from home last year and really felt very inadequate in kind of wearing all the hats that were there placed on her head. So this year she's opted to keep him at home again. The parents both have. And what we're doing now is giving her a weekly calendar of, we've had those kind of coaching interview conversations with her. And so now, I think actually we've even done it monthly now. There's a monthly calendar with different ideas, super simple, in how to incorporate some basic concepts, because you're right, parents aren't trained as teachers. They don't know how to expand on different ways to teach color recognition or shape recognition or any of those kind of basic things. So we've given her ways that she can take just normal routines in the home and spend the week in these various opportunities naturally throughout their day to just reinforce this concept or this concept. And she has found that very helpful. So I totally agree. And I think this is something we have to think about. And that's why we need to think about what are the needs in the home? What are the child's needs in learning at school? And how do we find ways to integrate and embed that into things that don't provide additional stress for the family? And sometimes that just takes a lot of creativity and some good conversations. But I think that burden should not be placed on the family. And again, is so dependent on what the child's innate skills are as well. So I completely understand the question, and that's the best I have to offer is just a good conversation about that and looking at ways to relieve your burden and still meet the needs of the child so that they can progress in growing towards where we want them to be.
Okay, thank you. And just to let you know, we have about 6 minutes left.
Okay, good. Well, then we're going to go through these other slides pretty quickly so we maybe have a little time. We're really close to the end. So we've talked a little bit about this coaching and there is a tremendous amount of research out there about parent coaching. And yes, it would take a little bit of time in the context of that other question, but the benefit of a little bit of time on the phone and engaging in that good conversation has proven to be well worth it as far as the literature is concerned. I'm going to go to this next slide here. Here are just some of the steps of coaching that are important. This also is a great website if those of you that are listening who are teachers or therapists. This website is available. It's called Seek Freaks. I don't think I actually put the website here, but it's Seacreeks. You can see it barely at the bottom of that green page, www.seacreeks.com. They have amazing articles for OTs, PTs, speech therapists, and parents. So it's really well done. Again, I'm not going to go through these, but I wanted you to have some steps so you would know some expectations for how goal-directed training works and how some resources around that. And the other slide here is about just the theme that is consistent through, how do we work towards student engagement, parent engagement, the use of the coaching strategy, the use of goal-directed training is all about relationship and finding out what are the challenges facing the family, again, related to that structural piece we looked at before. What are the things you'd like to change? What would it look like if whatever the problem is was better? What would that look like to you? So those are all really good questions to talk about with your providers, or if you are a provider, to talk about with your families. These are just some other considerations for group instruction. And let's see here. Again, so now we're close to the bottom, and if we have time to talk about your own experiences, what would be helpful, I'm happy to have some conversations about that. The next slide is just a whole series of resources, which you should be able to access in your packet of handouts, but I'd be very open to any other questions or conversation.
One other question, and that I think is also from a parent that says, we had occupational therapy as a consult in our child's IEP, but we're finding that there are many more situations that he's having difficulty with. How do we begin to initiate the process to be able to expand just the consultation to an actual OTPT situation?
So I'm assuming what you're asking is what can you do to shift from consultation to a more direct service delivery model? Because we think in terms of service delivery model. So the model that your child is currently receiving is a consultation model, and there is, a wide variety of things like a direct service model, and that can take on a wide variety of forms. So I think the question that would be good to ask is to first of all find out if where you're seeing the child's function lag behind what you think their performance could be, would be to ask the teachers if they're seeing the same thing as well. So that would be a good place to start. And then it may very well be that the consultation model is still the best model, but the consultation time needs to be increased. I just can't tell you the huge amount of literature that supports in-class interventions and what we call embedded strategies. It's phenomenal what a difference it makes, and I've seen this myself. So I think the good question, you're asking a great question, and I would say to continue with your line of thinking and to have continuing good questions is to find out from the teacher first where else that they're seeing a gap in the child's performance, and if it appears to be related to strategies and ideas that could come from an occupational therapist, then the conversation would be to have the team reconvene, go back to that disability-related needs conversation, identify the areas of functional performance where you're seeing a lag, and then the team can determine how to best meet that. But I would just say to you, consultation model of service delivery in and of itself is not a bad model. It might be that it's not getting generalized into other settings and aspects of the child's routines within the school setting. And I think that's equally as important. Is that helpful?
I think so. I don't have any follow-up question with that. And actually, we don't have any other questions. So if you have some closing thoughts, Carlin, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I am so grateful to have had this time with you. Please feel free to reach out to me or Andrea Bertoni, who's my colleague at DPI. We're the OTPT speech people, and I am excited to kind of hear back from you what it's been like for you to have the teleservice support. And also, we did branch a lot into best practices for both teleservice and face-to-face learning. So if you have ongoing questions about that, I'd be happy to come back someday. And I wish you all well, and I hope everyone stays healthy.
Okay, well, thank you so very much. I know that I learned a lot, and I'm sure that those on the call also did as well. This will conclude our webinar. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars for our academic year. And please check out our website calendar and register for any of the upcoming trainings that may be of interest to you. Also, please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after today's live presentation. Thank you again, Carlin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Be safe and stay healthy. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.